I never told my son that I made $90,000 a month. One day his wife looked at me and said, "Get out, you beggar." Then my son threw my belongings out the door. A month later, they saw my name on a deed. I bought their dream house, right across the street from them. Hello everyone, I'm Diana. I'm so glad you're here with me today. Please subscribe to the channel and give this video a thumbs up. Also, let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. I always love to see how far our stories travel. My name is Margaret Elaine Caldwell. I was 61 years old when my daughter-in-law called me broke and my son tossed my suitcases onto the front porch. The strangest part was that in all the years leading up to that night, I had never told either of them a single thing about my income. Let me take you back to the beginning. I spent nearly 2 decades working as a senior financial compliance officer at a private investment firm in Atlanta. The work was quiet, discreet, and highly rewarding. My salary, $90,000 a month, was something I never broadcasted, not out of shame, but out of habit. My mother raised me to believe that talking carelessly about money only hands others a weapon to use against you. I handled my finances the same way I handled my private life, structured, private, and entirely my own. When my husband Gerald passed away from a stroke 8 years ago, I poured all my energy into my career. Our son Daniel was 32 at the time, fully grown and settled into his own life as a project manager for a mid-sized construction company. I was deeply proud of him. He carried Gerald's strong jawline and my stubborn streak, a combination I always viewed as a blessing. In the summer of 2019, Daniel met Christine at a backyard barbecue hosted by a mutual friend. She was loud, striking, and completely confident in her own intelligence. A confidence I later realized was quite fragile, though I chose to overlook it at the time. I liked her, or rather, I tried my best to like her. When she moved in with Daniel, I brought her flowers. I helped address their wedding invitations. During Christmas dinner, when she started rearranging the living room furniture before the guests even arrived, I kept my thoughts to myself. For 3 years, I visited them every few weeks, never staying longer than a weekend. I brought groceries, helped tend to their garden, and watched their rescue dog, Biscuit, whenever they travelled. I never pried into Daniel's finances, and I never demanded that Christine prove herself to me. I thought we had an unspoken understanding, the kind that didn't require words. I was entirely wrong about that. The first warning sign came last January. I arrived for a visit and noticed that the small guest room at the end of the hall, where I usually slept, had been turned into a meditation space. Purple yoga mats covered the floor, and an essential oil diffuser filled the air with the scent of eucalyptus. While pouring coffee, Christine casually mentioned that she hoped I wouldn't mind sleeping on the living room pull-out sofa. She wasn't asking. She was telling. I slept on the sofa. The second sign arrived a month later. I overheard Christine talking to her sister on the phone. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I just happened to pass by the kitchen doorway, but her voice carried perfectly. "She doesn't contribute anything, Sandra," Christine said. "She just shows up, expects to be treated like royalty, and Daniel doesn't say a word." I stood frozen for a moment. Then I walked back to the living room and sat down with my book. The third sign came in April. Christine began talking about needing more space whenever I was within earshot. She had a habit of phrasing her own desires as shared decisions. "We feel like we need more privacy, Daniel," she would say. "We feel it's important to establish boundaries for our home." I watched Daniel nod along, recognizing a pattern in his compliance that I wasn't ready to confront just yet. But everything truly shattered on the evening of May 14th. I took the train down, believing it was a standard planned visit. Daniel had texted me the week before saying, "Come on Saturday, Mum. We miss you." I had packed a small overnight bag and brought a pot of homemade meat sauce. I arrived at 6 in the evening. Christine opened the door. She looked at me, looked at my bag, looked at the pot in my hands, and then glanced down at my sensible, practical shoes. Her expression shifted from surprise into a cold calculation. "Margaret," she said, using my actual name for the very first time. Before then, it had always been a dismissive mum, or nothing at all. "Daniel and I have talked," she continued. "We've decided we need this space to ourselves. It's just not a good time for us to host family indefinitely." I looked past her shoulder. Daniel was standing in the hallway, staring down at his phone. "Daniel," I called out. He looked up for a fraction of a second, then immediately looked back down at his screen. Christine stepped onto the porch, keeping her voice smooth and measured, like someone who had practiced this speech in the mirror. "We think it's best for everyone if you find your own accommodations when you visit. You're retired, right? You must have some savings. There are perfectly lovely hotels not far from here." I wanted to correct her on the word retired. I wasn't retired. I had never said I was. But as I watched Daniel continue to stare at his phone, I realized the word wasn't a mistake. It was a framework. They had constructed a specific version of me, aging, dependent, and useless, and they had been living with that version of me for a while. "Get out," Christine said, dropping the polite facade entirely. "I'm serious, Margaret. You have nowhere to go and offer nothing of value here. We don't need an old woman with nothing to her name overstaying her welcome." Daniel set his phone on the hallway table and walked upstairs without a word. 10 minutes later, my small travel bag landed on the porch beside me with a soft thud. He had walked downstairs, picked up my bag from the hallway, and placed it outside. He never reopened the door. I stood on that porch for a short moment in the warm May air, holding a pot of meat sauce, listening to the sound of their television turning on inside. Then I walked to my car, set the pot on the passenger seat, and drove to a hotel downtown. Somewhere between the lobby and the elevator ride to my room, a switch flipped inside me. I stayed at a Marriott on Peachtree Street. It was clean and completely impersonal, the kind of place where every hallway looks identical and nobody asks any questions. On that night, I was grateful for the anonymity. I sat on the edge of the bed with my shoes still on, my coat folded over my arm. The meat sauce went straight into the mini fridge. I ate a few spoonfuls for dinner using a plastic spoon from the coffee station, sitting at the small desk by the window, watching the taillights move on the streets below. I didn't cry. I want to be entirely clear about that, because stories like this usually involve tears. But I had spent 35 years in financial compliance. I learned long ago to process things logically, to let an emotion surface, map it out, and then set it aside to look at the hard facts. So I looked at the facts. Fact number 1. My son stood in the hallway with his phone, watching his wife tell me I was worthless, and chose silence. Fact number 2. They believed I was broke, or close to it, just as Christine had said. I had never corrected that impression because I had never created it. I simply never argued with the narrative they had quietly built for me. Fact number 3. I earned $90,000 a month, a reality that had been consistent for nearly 2 decades. Through disciplined investing and a quiet lifestyle, I had accumulated assets that would make Christine's jaw drop if she ever saw the actual numbers. Did I feel the deep sting of being cast aside by my own child? Yes. I won't pretend otherwise. Daniel was my son. He was the boy I stayed up with through fevers, nightmares, and the typical heartaches of high school. He was the son who called me every single Sunday, rain or shine, right up until he married Christine. I felt that loss with absolute clarity. It was a sharp, dull ache, like knowing a bone is bruised but not completely broken. But beneath that grief, something much quieter and more permanent took root. Rage is too loud a word for it. It was more like an intense clarity. They had made an assumption. That assumption was a massive error, and errors have consequences. I opened my laptop and spent the next 2 hours reviewing real estate listings. Not rentals, and not temporary furnished apartments. I looked at properties for sale in the Brookhaven neighborhood of Atlanta, strictly within a 2-mile radius of Daniel and Christine's house. Why so close? I'll be honest about that too. Part of it was entirely practical. I had spent 3 years building Daniel's neighborhood into the rhythm of my life. My favorite coffee shop, the walking trails along the creek. Listen, the Saturday morning farmers market. I was absolutely not going to be driven away from an entire neighborhood because of a yoga mat or a woman who called me an old beggar on my own son's porch. But there was another part, a colder part, that is harder to admit. Because of their assumptions, I had been rendered completely invisible. I decided it was time to become very, very visible. I found the property on the 3rd page of listings. A beautiful colonial-style home, located at 412 Whitmore Lane. 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, original hardwood floors, a wraparound porch, and a slightly overgrown but structurally sound garden. It sat directly across the street from Daniel and Christine. I stared at the listing photos for a long time. The house itself wasn't the main point. Over time, its history, its structure, and its garden would come to mean something real to me. But on that first night, sitting on the edge of a Marriott bed with a plastic spoon and leftover meat sauce, looking at that photo made everything click into place. The asking price was $1.2 million. I had the liquidity to cover it completely. The next morning, I called my real estate attorney, Beverly Marsh. Beverly was 64, had represented me in 2 previous property transactions, and possessed a natural calm that made her entirely unshakable. I explained what I wanted to do and why. There was a brief silence on the line. "Margaret," she said, "this is either the smartest decision I've heard all year, or the most dramatic." "Can't it be both?" I asked. "In my experience," she replied, "when a woman is both smart and dramatic,
she's usually right." She initiated the preliminary inquiries that afternoon.
At the same time, I called my doctor and checked in with my office. I was maintaining a modified remote workload, not retired, never retired, and scheduled an appointment at my hair salon for the following Thursday. I learned long ago that when life delivers a blow, the worst thing you can do is stop taking care of yourself. The world reads your appearance as information, and I intended to control exactly what it read. I didn't call Daniel either. I want to be precise about the structure of this decision. I stayed silent not because I was too hurt to speak, but because I knew any conversation at that stage would give them the opportunity to paint me as an emotional, overreacting, difficult mother-in-law. They had already written that script. I wasn't going to walk into it. I would wait. I would move. And then the story would rewrite itself. Over the next 2 weeks, Beverly confirmed the property was available. The sellers were motivated, and an all-cash offer could close the deal within 30 days. I made the cash offer. The inspection came back clean, showing the house was in excellent condition, aside from some minor gutter repairs and a bathroom that needed recaulking. I negotiated $15,000 off the asking price, and the sellers accepted. I signed the purchase agreement on June 3rd, with closing set for June 28th. I didn't tell a soul in Daniel's circle, no family friends, no distant cousins, no anyone who might let it slip at the wrong time. After 35 years in compliance, I knew exactly how to manage information. 13 days later, a piece of news reached me that shifted my plan from a personal choice into an absolute necessity. The first official steps of the purchase were much quieter than you might think. Beverly filed the paperwork under the name of a holding company, a limited liability company I had established years ago for property management, called Caldwell Heritage Properties LLC. It was entirely legal and completely standard, meaning that during the pending sale, the name Margaret Elaine Caldwell never appeared on any public documents. Anyone searching the county registry database would only find a corporate entity purchasing 412 Whitmore Lane. Was I hiding? No, I simply wasn't announcing it out loud. There is a profound difference. Throughout my career, I've always understood the line between concealment and discretion. Concealment implies wrongdoing. Discretion implies good judgment. I was simply using my judgment.
During those weeks, I drove past the house twice, once after the inspection and once after the price negotiation. Both times I parked down the street and sat in my car, looking at the wide front porch and the old magnolia tree dropping leaves onto the sidewalk. Both times I had a clear view right across the street to Daniel and Christine's house. Their front door was painted a trendy dark grey. Christine's white SUV sat in the driveway, flanked by matching potted plants on the steps.
I wondered how they would react when they saw the moving trucks arrive. Then I drove away to focus on more useful things. In the second week of June, 12 days after Beverly started the closing process, I received a phone call from my nephew, Paul. Paul was the son of Gerald's older brother, 38 years old, and worked in commercial real estate development. Crucially, he was also the kind of person who talked to everyone and remembered everything. "Aunt Margaret," he began, "I don't know if this is my business, but Daniel called me last week." I waited for him to continue. "He was asking around about your financial situation. Specifically, he wanted to know if you ever held any major assets, or if you've always just been his words, not mine. Comfortable, but not wealthy. I set my coffee cup down. What did you tell him? I asked. I told him I honestly didn't know, Paul said. Which is the truth. You've never discussed it with me. But Aunt Margaret, the reason I'm calling is that he also asked if I thought you might need financial assistance in the coming years, as if the family needed to start planning for it. I picked up my cup again and took a slow sip. He was asking if I needed a handout. Essentially, yes, that's exactly what he meant. I thanked Paul sincerely and hung up the phone. I sat motionless at the kitchen table of my temporary apartment for a long time. It was a furnished 2-bedroom place in Buckhead where I was waiting out the closing period, having not yet informed my downtown building that I was vacating my lease. I weighed the implications of Daniel's questions. It meant he was gathering evidence, not out of malice. Daniel wasn't inherently malicious, he was just weak, which can sometimes be far more dangerous. He was gathering evidence to justify what they had already done. They had thrown me out in May, and now in June, he was quietly checking around to confirm that I was indeed financially struggling. He was looking for a retroactive excuse for abandoning his mother. But it wasn't just the excuse that concerned me. If Daniel was making calls, he might be making plans. And some of those plans could intersect with my estate in ways I hadn't anticipated. I called Beverly right back. I need to review my estate planning documents, I told her. Today, if possible. I need to see exactly where Daniel stands in my current will. There was that familiar, knowing pause from her end of the line. I'll have the paperwork ready by 2, she said. That afternoon, I drove to Beverly's office in Buckhead. Her space was on the 12th floor of a building overlooking Lennox Road. All clean glass, fine leather chairs, and the distinct quiet that belongs to rooms where major decisions are made without high drama. We reviewed the will. Under the current terms, Daniel was the primary beneficiary of my estate, positioned to inherit roughly 70% of my assets, with the remainder designated for 2 charities I had supported for years. I want to change this, I said. Beverly nodded, as if she had been expecting it. I want to restructure his position entirely. I want to establish a charitable trust as the primary vehicle with a discretionary clause for future adjustments, and I want it done before the house closing goes through. You're protecting against a potential claim down the road, Beverly noted. I'm protecting against an immediate assumption, I told her. Daniel doesn't know what I have, but he's getting curious. Curiosity can turn into entitlement, and entitlement can turn into legal action. I prefer to build my defenses long before anyone decides to mount an attack. Beverly drafted the codicil within a week. I signed the revised documents on June 19th. That was the moment of no return. Not because a will can't be changed again. It certainly can. But because signing it forced me to convert an emotional reality into a structured, permanent fact. My son had placed himself on the opposite side of a boundary, and I needed to respond accordingly, not out of revenge, but out of clear-eyed self-preservation. On June 28th, the closing on 412 Whitmore Lane was completed. I was officially the owner of the 4-bedroom colonial directly across from Daniel and Christine. They still had no idea, but I noticed that very afternoon, just as Beverly emailed the final confirmation, Christine posted a series of photos online. Their living room had just been redecorated in white and gold tones. The caption read, "Our dream home. Finally, completely ours." I stared at the photos for a moment, closed the tab, and picked up the phone to coordinate the movers. The moving trucks arrived at 412 Whitmore Lane on a Saturday morning in mid-July. It was a warm day, the kind of heavy Atlanta heat that feels like a weight on your shoulders. The old magnolia tree in the front yard looked refreshed now that I had hired a crew to clear the walkway and tidy up the overgrowth. I had spent the previous week visiting the house informally, overseeing the minor repairs Beverly's contractors had handled, selecting paint colours from swatches I taped to the walls, and walking through the empty rooms at different times of day to watch how the light shifted. The house had excellent bones. Before the family put it on the market, it had been owned by a retired professor for 30 years. It possessed a quiet, settled character, the feel of a place where a real life had been lived, not just a stage set up for quick resale. I found myself genuinely liking it right away, which surprised me a little. I had expected to view it as a purely strategic move, but instead it felt like a home. The moving truck was massive, carrying pieces of furniture I'd kept in storage for 2 years. It blocked a portion of Whitmore Lane for nearly 3 hours. The movers were professional and efficient, and I stood on the porch with a clipboard and a mug of coffee, directing the flow of boxes. I didn't look across the street. I didn't need to. I could tell the exact moment they noticed. It happened around 10:30 in the morning. I heard Daniel and Christine's front door click open, followed by the sharp tone of Christine's voice. I couldn't hear the specific words, but the pitch alone told me everything. Then came a heavy silence, the sound of Daniel's deeper voice, a long pause, and finally, footsteps crossing the asphalt. I was discussing the placement of a heavy oak bookcase with one of the movers when Christine reached the edge of my front lawn. She was wearing athletic clothes with her hair pulled back, and her face held the look of someone whose entire understanding of reality had just been disrupted. "What is going on here?" she demanded. I turned around and looked down at her calmly. "Good morning, Christine. It's a moving truck. This is my house." Her voice dropped to a flat whisper. "You bought this house?" "Yes," I replied. "Would you like some coffee? I have a thermos inside."
She just stared at me. How? How did you... We thought...
"You thought I was an old beggar with nowhere to go and nothing to offer?" I said it without any anger in my voice, simply repeating the words as a statement of fact to show I remembered them. "I recall you saying exactly that on your porch." The expression that crossed Christine's face was an intricate mix of shock and calculation. "Daniel," she called out without looking back. I realized he had been standing at the edge of the driveway for at least 30 seconds. He stepped forward slowly, looking at the house, looking at me, and then looking at my dining table as the movers carried it past, a piece I had found at an estate sale 30 years ago and refinished with my own hands. "Mom," was all he managed to say. "Daniel," I replied. A long silence followed. A mockingbird in the magnolia tree sang a rapid series of notes, which felt strangely appropriate given the sudden quiet. "You can't be serious," Christine said, turning her focus back to me. Her voice regained its sharp edge. "You did this on purpose. You did this to spy on us, to harass us." "I bought a home," I said, "on the open market, in a neighborhood I have visited regularly for 3 years. There is no legal mechanism preventing me from doing so." "We'll see about that," she snapped, her tone suggesting she was grasping for a weapon she didn't actually possess. I didn't bother responding. I turned back to the mover and told him the bookcase looked perfect exactly where it was. Over the next 3 days, my phone rang 4 times with calls from Daniel. I didn't answer any of them. I received 2 text messages. One asked me to reconsider, a phrase so vague it carried no real weight. The second claimed my actions were abnormal, which, given the circumstances, struck me as mildly ironic. On the 4th day, a formal letter arrived at my new address. Christine had consulted a family law attorney, a man named Brett Hollis, who sent a formal notice implying that my purchase of an adjacent property constituted a targeted effort to distress them. The letter threatened a restraining order if I engaged in any form of surveillance, trespassing, or intimidation. I scanned the document and forwarded it straight to Beverly. When she called me back that afternoon, her tone carried a highly amused professionalism. "He's citing statutes meant for domestic disputes between former partners," she explained. "You are your son's mother. You purchased a property on the open market using legal funds. Since moving in, you've had exactly one conversation with your daughter-in-law, which she initiated by approaching you on your private property. What do you recommend?" I asked. "I recommend we send Mr. Hollis a very polite response," she said. "We will outline our full understanding of the law, note that my client is engaged in no actionable behavior, and make it clear that any attempt to file an unfounded restraining order will be met with a counterclaim for attorney fees and sanctions." We sent the letter. Mr. Hollis never replied. Later that evening, I sat on my wraparound porch, watching fireflies rise above the grass. My neighbour to the north, a retired school teacher named Doris, waved to me from her own porch. I waved back. Neither of us said a word, which felt like the perfect amount of communication for a quiet evening. I was tired. It wasn't the exhaustion of defeat, but the heavy, deliberate fatigue that follows a period of intense focus and effort. I allowed myself 3 days of absolute quiet. I didn't contact any professionals, and I didn't make any decisions. I sat in the garden in the mornings, walked along the creek trail, ate well, and slept deeply, letting the house become truly mine. On the fourth morning, I brewed a fresh pot of coffee, sat down at the kitchen table, and opened my laptop. There was still work to be done. I could feel it. It was Doris who inadvertently showed me that I needed to stop operating in the shadows and start living openly in the neighborhood. We had our first real conversation 3 days after my quiet period ended. She was clipping dead blooms from the roses near our shed fence line, and I had put on a pair of gardening gloves to clear out my own neglected flower beds. We fell into the easy rhythm of two people working in the dirt with no urgent schedule. Doris Whitfield was 68 years old and had lived on Whitmore Lane for 22 years. She viewed the changes in the neighborhood with the calm perspective of someone who had long ago decided that peace of mind was the only rational approach to life. She had taught high school English for 3 decades. Her husband had passed away from cancer 6 years prior, and she had 2 daughters who called her every Sunday. As I would soon find out, she was also the informal social historian of the street. This house sat empty for nearly a year, she told me, using her shears on a stubborn stem. Dr. Abernethy's family took quite a while to settle his estate. We're all just glad to see someone living here again. It's a wonderful house, I noted. It is, she agreed. I've always said so. Dr. Abernethy used to grow the most beautiful hydrangeas along the south fence. You should think about putting some back in. We talked for 40 minutes. She didn't pry into my personal life, and I didn't question hers. By the time we finished, she had invited me to the monthly meeting of her garden club, which rotated among the members' homes. I accepted. I liked her style, principled yet warm, a combination that is rare and incredibly valuable. The following week brought the first attempt at what I can only call a reconciliation strategy. Daniel called on a Tuesday morning while I was at my desk. On Tuesdays, I worked from home, reviewing compliance documentation for a couple of long-standing corporate clients. I let the phone ring twice before picking up, not to be difficult, but because I had learned to let things happen at a controlled pace, rather than rushing to meet them. "Mom," he said, "I want to talk." His voice sounded different from the last time I heard it. Softer, more guarded. I could hear Christine's influence in the phrasing, a clear sign that this wasn't an impulsive call. "I'm listening," I replied. "We feel, Christine and I, that this whole situation has gotten entirely out of hand. We want to sit down with you, have a real conversation, and put the past behind us." "That's a very generous way to frame it," I remarked. "Mom, please," he urged. "We've talked. We both agree that things were said that shouldn't have been said, and we just want to move forward." Did I feel a pull at that moment? Yes, I won't deny it. He was my son. Hearing him use that specific tone, the one that reminded me of the 18-year-old boy calling home from college when he ran into trouble, hit a vulnerable spot I hadn't completely protected. But I listened very carefully to his actual words. He didn't say, "I was wrong." He didn't say, "I should have stopped, Christine." He didn't say, "I should have treated you better." He said, "Things were said that shouldn't have been said." It was a passive sentence designed to spread the blame so thin that nobody could actually be held accountable. And he wanted to move forward, a phrase that almost always translates to, "Stop doing things that make me uncomfortable." "Daniel, I'm not interested in moving forward just for the sake of appearances," I told him. "If you want a genuine conversation about what happened, my door is open, but I won't pre-commit to a peaceful resolution before we even talk." A long pause followed. "Christine feels like—" he started. "What do you feel?" I interrupted. "Not Christine. You." Another silence stretched between us, even longer this time. "I think we need to talk," he finally said. "In person?" "Then come over," I told him. "Whenever you're ready. You know exactly where I live." He didn't laugh, and I didn't expect him to, but saying it made something settle inside me. A small, precise weight lifted from my chest. I didn't hear from him for the rest of the week, but something far more significant happened during those days. I attended Doris's garden club meeting at the home of a woman named Patricia, just 4 blocks away. I sat with 6 women ranging in age from 55 to 79. For 2 hours I drank excellent tea, listened, and shared stories. By the end of the afternoon, I felt something I hadn't experienced since May. A sense of belonging. That was the exact word for it. Ever since that evening on Daniel's porch, I had been drifting in a space defined by strategy and necessity, but it was an incredibly solitary existence. The plan I was executing was the right plan, but a strategy without a community around it has no texture, no witnesses, and no real life. These women, Doris, Patricia, and the others, had nothing to do with my strategy. They were far better than any plan. They represented the true beginning of my life on Whitmore Lane. I walked home that evening through the warm August air, passing the hydrangea bushes I had started to clear out. I felt a deep, quiet certainty that I was exactly where I belonged. They arrived on a Saturday morning without any warning. At 11 o'clock, I was sitting on the porch reading a biography of a female Federal Reserve economist whose long career had been consistently underestimated, a reality she found deeply educational. The doorbell rang. I looked up to see the two of them standing outside my front door. Christine was holding a plant, a small potted orchid wrapped in delicate tissue paper. The gesture was meant to signal a peace offering, but the tight set of her jaw told a completely different story. I set my book aside and opened the door. "We were just in the area," Christine said, which was technically true, but still struck me as absurd. She handed over the plant. "We wanted to bring this by as a housewarming gift." I accepted it. "Thank you. Come inside." I brewed coffee, determined to be a proper hostess. In difficult situations, hospitality isn't always born of warmth, it's a reflection of discipline. I brought out my finest china cups, pieces I had found at an estate sale in Decatur, and sliced a lemon pound cake I had baked the day before. We sat at the kitchen table in the very house they likely never imagined I could afford. I looked at them and waited. Christine spoke first. "Margaret, we want you to know that we've reflected deeply on how things unfolded, and we both believe that family is what matters most. We don't want to be at odds." The wording was flawless. I noticed she chose reflected instead of reconsidered, implying thought without any actual course correction. I also noticed she used at odds instead of in conflict, softening the personal edge of what had taken place. "I'm glad to hear that," I replied. "We were thinking," Daniel added, keeping his eyes fixed on his coffee cup, "that since you're settled in across the street, there might be a way to restructure things, so everything feels a bit more normal." "What would that look like?" I asked. That was the moment the pretense vanished. Christine leaned forward slightly. "Well, for instance, you're right here across the street, and we're right over there. It only makes sense to consider how this proximity affects things like asset management, estate planning, and long-term family arrangements." I let the silence linger for a few seconds. "You're asking about my will," I said plainly. Christine didn't flinch. "We're saying that since we're neighbours now, it's only logical to think about the future as a family unit." "We could be part of your decision-making process," Daniel added. I could hear the word control hidden beneath the phrase part of. "You shouldn't have to manage all of this completely on your own." I looked at my son. I remembered the boy I had raised, not through a lens of nostalgic sentiment, but with the sharp clarity of real memory. He had been a gentle, perceptive child. He wasn't a bad person. He was simply someone who allowed another person's desires to override his own so completely that he could no longer tell where his boundaries ended and hers began. "Daniel," I said, "I appreciate your concern, but I have attorneys, accountants, and financial advisors who are perfectly capable of managing my affairs. The absolute last thing I require right now is advice." Christine's tone turned ice cold in an instant. "What we're trying to say, Margaret, and I think you know this, is that the situation you've created by buying this house and living here isn't sustainable. It's abnormal. People are talking." "Which people?" I asked, genuinely curious. "The neighbours, the family, everyone can see exactly what you're doing. And what is it that I am doing?" I asked. She hesitated because the honest answer was, "You are living your life near us, and it makes us uncomfortable." That wasn't an accusation she could make out loud without sounding entirely unreasonable. "You're trying to make us feel guilty," she claimed instead. "I'm sitting at my own kitchen table, drinking coffee," I replied. "If you feel guilty, Christine, that is a conversation between you and whatever choices are causing you to feel that way. Daniel made a quiet, frustrated sound, and Christine stood up abruptly. "This was a mistake," she said. "We tried to be civil. We tried to extend an olive branch, and you brought me an orchid and started asking about my estate within 10 minutes of sitting down," I said quietly. "I'm not entirely sure that's how an olive branch works." They left. Christine walked briskly down the path, while Daniel moved slower, pausing just once to look back at the house and at me. Then he turned and followed his wife across the street. After they left, I stood by the door for a moment. Did I feel a trace of fear? Yes, a cold, tiny knot formed just beneath my ribs. It wasn't fear of them, but rather a fear of what they represented. The reality that this might never be resolved, that my son had crossed a line where I could no longer reach him, and that the distance between who he used to be and who he was now had become a permanent canyon. But over 61 years, I had learned that fear is merely data, not a directive. It tells you something valuable is at stake, but it never commands you to retreat. I went back inside, cleared the coffee cups, and ate a slice of the lemon cake. Then I sat at my desk and drafted a precise 4-paragraph email to Beverly, outlining exactly what had been said at my kitchen table, documenting the conversation chronologically with a specific focus on their language regarding estate planning and family arrangements. Document everything, Beverly had told me from the very start, and date every entry. I had been doing exactly that since May. The Whitmore Lane Neighbourhood Association held its quarterly meeting on the second Thursday of September in the community room of the local library on Dresden Drive. It was a modest functional organisation that handled road maintenance complaints, coordinated holiday lighting schedules, and occasionally offered feedback on zoning variances. Doris served as the secretary, and Patricia was the president. I hadn't originally planned to attend, but on the Monday before the meeting, Paul called me again. "I thought you should know," he said. Christine reached out to me again. She also apparently contacted 2 or 3 other people in the extended family. I'm not sure how she got their numbers, but she's been claiming that you are mentally unstable. She's telling people you bought the house purely out of spite and that you're suffering from a psychological breakdown. I remained silent for a beat. What is her objective? "She's building a narrative," Paul said. "I think they intend to raise the issue formally at the neighbourhood association meeting. I think they want to pressure the board into demanding you sell the property." Was I surprised? Not entirely. From the moment they showed up at my kitchen table with an orchid and questions about my assets, I knew they were still calculating their next move. What did surprise me was the sheer desperation of it, that they were willing to approach strangers and fabricate a story about my mental health just to use community leverage against me. Did they really think that would work on someone like me? I called Beverly and relayed what Paul had told me. She made specific statements to third parties regarding your mental competence, Beverly noted, that can cross into defamation depending on the exact phrasing and the audience. I'll need Paul's account in writing. Paul sent over a detailed written summary that afternoon, complete with dates, communication channels, and the exact language Christine had used. I forwarded it to Beverly for our records. Then I put on a sharp, charcoal grey wool suit I had purchased in London 8 years ago and kept meticulously maintained. I drove to the neighbourhood association meeting. I arrived slightly early. Doris was busy setting up rows of folding chairs, and she gave me a long, evaluating look as I walked in. "I heard some rumours this week," she said quietly. "So did I replied. "Good," she said, handing me a chair to unfold. There were 17 people in the room when the meeting officially began. 4 minutes after Patricia called the session to order, Daniel and Christine arrived. Christine looked entirely composed and well put together, understanding the value of public presentation. Daniel sat beside her, keeping his eyes fixed on the table. The meeting moved through its standard agenda. A lingering pothole the city had failed to patch, a request for a new crosswalk near the elementary school, and a brief discussion about the upcoming holiday decorations. Then Christine raised her hand. Patricia granted her the floor, and Christine stood up to introduce herself. She spoke about her family, how they'd loved living on Whitmore for 3 years, and stated she had a matter to bring before the group. The issue, as she phrased it, involved a recent property purchase directly across the street that raised serious concerns regarding the buyer's motivations. She claimed she had reason to believe the purchase wasn't made out of a genuine desire to join the community, but rather as a campaign of personal distress directed at her family. She mentioned she had spoken with several relatives and claimed there was a pattern of behaviour the neighbourhood needed to be aware of. She paused, waiting for a murmur of agreement or for heads to turn toward me. The room remained completely silent. Patricia looked over in my direction. "Mrs. Caldwell," she said, "would you care to respond?" I stood up, deliberately looking past Christine to address the entire room. I looked at Doris, at Patricia, and at the faces of the neighbours I had come to know over the past 6 weeks, through the garden club and life on the street. "My name is Margaret Elaine Caldwell," I said. "I am a senior compliance officer with 17 years of experience in financial regulation. I am not retired. I purchased the property at 412 Whitmore Lane through entirely legal means, using my own independent funds at a fair market price. When I first reviewed the listing, I did not consult my son's address. I recognized the neighborhood as one I had grown familiar with over 3 years of visits. The house was available, and I bought it. I paused for a brief moment. My daughter-in-law told me to get out on May 14th, using the exact phrase that I was an old beggar with nothing to my name. My son stood in the hallway and said absolutely nothing. I checked into a hotel, located the real estate listing, and purchased a home. I paused again, letting the words sink in. I have not trespassed, I have not harassed anyone, and I have violated no laws or community standards. Yet my mental competence has been questioned in private communications with neighbours, without a shred of evidence, by someone who simply appears uncomfortable with my presence on the street. I reached into my bag and placed 3 sets of documents on the main table. A copy of the purchase agreement showing the legal holding entity, a copy of my current employment verification letter proving my active status, and Paul's written account of Christine's statements. I am submitting these for the record, I concluded, because I understand concerns were raised. I believe in addressing concerns directly. I sat back down. The room was perfectly still. Christine began to protest, claiming I was misrepresenting the facts. "Mrs. Holloway," Patricia interrupted firmly, but calmly, "we have heard from both sides. I do not see this as a matter for the neighbourhood association to adjudicate. Mrs. Caldwell is a lawful property owner and an active, welcome participant in our community. We will move to the next item on the agenda." "There are things she isn't telling you," Christine insisted. "Christine," Daniel said very quietly. It was the first word he had uttered all evening, and it stopped her completely. I looked at my son, who was staring down at the table with his hands flat on the surface. In his rigid, careful posture, I recognized the look of someone who had finally seen the full reality of his situation at a devastating cost. I looked away. Patricia proceeded with the next agenda item, and someone brought up the crosswalk request again. The meeting concluded 40 minutes later, and the crowd slowly filed out. 3 neighbours stopped by briefly to offer a kind word, keeping it short but making their support clear. A woman named Helen, whom I hadn't met before, took my hand and said, "My mother-in-law lived with us for 12 years, and she was the absolute light of our home." I thanked her sincerely. I drove back to my house and sat on the porch. The fireflies were gone, as it was now late in September, but the air was perfectly still. The street was quiet, and the magnolia tree stood exactly where it belonged. I felt entirely calm, clear-headed, and absolutely certain of myself. 3 weeks after the association meeting, Beverly called me on a Friday morning. I did some checking, she said, running a routine background look into the Holloways' financial standing for our records. "Tell me," I replied. What she uncovered wasn't a sudden disaster, but rather the slow, predictable accumulation of poor choices made by 2 people living far beyond their means. Daniel and Christine had purchased their Brookhaven home 3 years ago at the absolute limit of their financial capacity. Christine had left her marketing position 8 months prior to attempt independent consulting, which had yet to generate any meaningful revenue. Daniel's salary was steady, but simply couldn't cover their overhead alone. They had accumulated massive credit card debt financing renovations. specifically the white and gold living room Christine had proudly posted online as their dream home. Furthermore, their recent application for a home equity refinancing loan had just been rejected. On what grounds? I asked. Debt-to-income ratio, Beverly explained. The remodelling expenses pushed them completely over the threshold. As for their attorney, Mr. Hollis hasn't filed a single thing since our reply. He won't, because there is no case, and I suspect his retainer ran dry. I processed this information with the same professional detachment I applied to any financial assessment. Those were the facts, the conditions, and the underlying reality. I want to send Daniel a letter, I told her. A personal note from me, not a legal document. That afternoon, I sat at my kitchen table and hand-wrote the letter on fine stationery, choosing not to run it past Beverly. It was a letter from a mother to her son, written without any artificial softness or cruelty, stating exactly what needed to be said. I told him I was aware of the refinancing rejection. I told him that after his June phone call to Paul evaluating my financial status, I had updated my estate planning documents. Not as a punishment, but as a standard measure of protection. I told him I didn't believe he was an unprincipled man, but rather someone who had allowed another person's low opinion to dictate his actions because compliance was easier than standing firm. I explained that my finances were never kept secret as a power play. They were kept private because I believed broadcasting wealth creates unnecessary risk, a belief that had been proven entirely correct. I made it clear that I would not be selling my home on Whitmore Lane. Finally, I told him that I loved him with the complex love a parent holds for an adult child who has deeply disappointed them. No less than before, but differently, carrying the specific ache of someone who has recalculated a cost and decided it was still worth enduring. I concluded by saying that if he ever wanted to sit at my kitchen table for an honest conversation, one without manipulation, negotiation, or hidden agendas, the coffee would be ready, and I would be waiting. I folded the pages into an envelope, walked across the street on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, and slid it directly through the mail slot of their dark grey front door. I heard it land on the floor inside. Then I walked back to my house, prepared dinner, and ate in the quiet comfort of my own kitchen. 2 days later, a final generic notice arrived from Hollis, claiming my letter constituted uninvited contact. Beverly issued a standard response within the hour, and we never heard from his office again. 3 months after the neighborhood meeting, Daniel called me on a Sunday evening. "Mom," he said. "Daniel," I responded. "I've read that letter a dozen times," he confessed. "I don't even know what to say." "There is no expiration date on it," I told him. "We're dealing with a lot of challenges right now," he admitted, financially and otherwise. "I know," I said, "and I'm sorry." I truly was sorry. Not for the outcome, but for the reality that it required this much distance to finally bring the truth to light. "I think I need to have that real conversation," he said. "Then come over," I replied. "I'll put the coffee on." He arrived alone the following Sunday, and we talked for 3 hours. I won't recount the details of that conversation. It was entirely private, the way any true reckoning must be. Not because it contained secrets, but because it involved real, plain truths, spoken between two people who had finally stopped keeping score. There were no winners in the traditional sense. There was only the long, quiet, and necessary process of a family learning to speak honestly again. I had initiated that process by purchasing a house, and sometimes a significant change requires a very large first step. The hydrangeas along the south fence bloomed beautifully that spring. Doris had been entirely right about the root system. It was completely intact, just heavily neglected. After a proper pruning in April and consistent watering, they produced a distinct deep violet shade that I couldn't have predicted, an attribute I grew to appreciate as their finest quality. I spent the first Saturday of May cutting fresh stems for every room in the house, leaving plenty of extra blooms for Doris and for Helen, who had become a true friend over the winter months. I was happy, and I want to state that clearly. Moving across the street wasn't a declaration of war. It was an act of complete self-determination, a refusal to be diminished, and a choice to place myself where I could truly flourish. I continued my work, completely unretired. My schedule settled into 3 full days and 2 half days, leaving ample time for the garden, the club, and long walks along the creek trail. In November, my firm handed me the most generous performance review of my career. I also began attending a monthly lecture series on economic history at the local university, sitting in the third row and asking questions, a form of community I enjoyed immensely. As for Daniel and Christine, she accepted a full-time corporate marketing position in February, as the independent consulting venture had failed to gain traction. She chose not to post about the transition online. In March, their refinancing application was resubmitted and ultimately approved, albeit at a higher interest rate. Daniel mentioned it one Sunday with a tone of profound relief, mixed with the slight humility of someone acknowledging their limitations. Daniel now visits for coffee most Sundays. We talk about my work, his projects, the garden, and memories of Gerald. One afternoon in April, he asked me what my mother had been like. We sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours, watching the afternoon sun stream through the windows. By the time he left, something fundamental had shifted. Quietly, the way real change always happens. Christine has not visited, and I am entirely patient. I have learned the true value of patience. On a warm Saturday in May, while I was sitting out on the porch, Doris looked over from her rose bushes. "You look completely settled in, Margaret," she called out. "Yes," I replied, looking around at my home. Settled. It was exactly the right word.